Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm your host, Brian Keane, best-selling author of the book, The Fitness Mindset and Rewire Your Mindset, here to help you by deconstructing expert guests on all things health, fitness and mindset. Today's guest is with the DNA dietitian, Rachel Clarkson. In today's episode, we go through an A to Z guide on everything from inflammation, boosting metabolism for weight loss, and eating the DNA way. This was a super enjoyable conversation. I've been really looking forward to this podcast since we set it up. Rachel is a Nutrigenomic dietitian and a university lecturer who specializes in research around eating for your genetics and eating around your genetic variability and personalized nutrition based on specific goals. Today's episode, we dive through everything from inflammation and its effect on your body, positive and negative, high-inflammatory diets and the benefits of reducing things like low-grade chronic inflammation, metabolic impairment and starvation syndrome, and some of the misconceptions around that, how to boost your metabolism, the actual scientific approach, and avoiding the misconception and the nonsense online on things that tell you can boost your metabolism, the things that don't actually work. Alcohol sensitivity and your genes, alcohol tips for weight loss, dairy and plant-based sources for non-dairy consumers, amongst other things. So that's just a fire hose approach of the introduction for today on a lot of different topics that we covered. I love Rachel's content. She's got a fantastic Instagram page as well. She does a myth busting Monday every Monday, something I stay tuned for myself just because it gets me thinking about some of the latest research that's been done in especially in regards to areas of genetics. So without further ado, here is today's wide-ranging conversation around all things health, wellness, fat loss, weight loss, and body compositional change. Rachel Clarkson on inflammation, boosting metabolism for weight loss, and eating the DNA way. Enjoy. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today with my guest, Rachel Clarkson. Rachel is a Nutrigenomic dietitian and university lecturer on a mission to free people from the guesswork around what they should be eating. She spent years trying to figure out what foods were right for her and ended up feeling totally confused, low on energy, and defeated by the world of wellness. Listening to self-proclaimed experts in the field, she started to cut out many of her favorite foods and ended up malnourished. She couldn't have been further away from her goals to feel full of life with the body of her dreams. 11 years have passed and extensive training and research into inflammation, genetics and nutrition provided her with the knowledge to personalize her own diet according to her DNA. Rachel has created a framework for her patients to eat the DNA way and finally meet their unique requirements. I'm looking forward to catching up on all things DNA, diets and personalized nutrition in today's episode. Rachel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Brian, for having me. And wow, that's an intro and a half.
I've been dying to chat because we've been talking about doing a podcast for ages now. We had a couple of different miscommunications on days and chatting back and forth. And today we were kind of getting our mic and everything set up. So I've been looking forward to this conversation for ages. So there was no way I was postponing it any longer. So for anyone that isn't familiar with you, Rachel, and we will get into everything that you specialize in, because I think you put out fantastic content, particularly on Instagram for people who are following you. But tell us a little bit about your backstory and what got you into the world of nutrition in particular.
Yeah, so it all started just over 10 years ago when I was at university actually studying biomedical science, really interested in inflammation, which is really the underlying cause of all chronic disease. And I got super interested in not just treating inflammation, but how do we actually prevent inflammation from occurring in the first place? And so I took it upon myself to do a lot of reading and research into the area of wellness or nutrition. And at the time, it wasn't necessarily very science-based. It was more research around people's opinion, whether it be blogs or books. I was super passionate about it and actually ended up doing exactly what you mentioned in my intro, which was cutting out major food groups, taking just a whole load of supplements that, I didn't actually know whether they were good for me. I just knew that they were great supplements to take. And I just ended up in a really unhealthy place. My hair was dry, wouldn't really grow much. My nails, my skin, like the whole works. Like I just didn't look healthy. And that's when it dawned upon me that actually nutrition is a science and not an opinion. And so I thought, you know what, this is what I want to, spend my life, throwing myself into. So that's when I actually went to take a master's in nutritional science at King's College. And it was at that point that I was like really thrown into the deep end, into like the molecular biology and sort of biochemistry of nutrients. So that's kind of my backstory of nutrition. And then I guess you have questions about how I got into other areas too.
Talk about inflammation, because that's not something that I've covered too much on the podcast. And I know that, it's your background. It's the thing that kind of introduced you into the area of, you expanded into obviously genetics and nutrition and then specifically in the DNA way, the framework that you created. But what's some of the misconceptions people have around inflammation? Because this is kind of something that people can have a one size fits all. Inflammation is bad, some inflammation is good potentially. What are some of the general misconceptions you get online when it comes to inflammation in particular? Just because I know a lot of the root issues for problems, and I know you do this with the personalized nutrition, can come from inflammation. But what are some of the main misconception that you see around inflammation in general, particularly with people who message you online?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think this is a really hot topic, especially in this space, because actually inflammation is the body's sort of protective mechanism against externals like diseases. And, if you cut yourself, it's actually a really great thing to have going on in the body. And this traditional inflammation shouldn't be seen as a negative. But what we are trying to do is prevent that low-grade chronic inflammation or metabolic inflammation, which is almost like in the background if your lifestyle isn't on point. So, for example, if you have excess adipose tissue or let's say like fat cells, so excess fat in places, especially around the abdomen, this is going to be pumping out inflammatory biomarkers. And we don't want that because, like I said, low-grade chronic inflammation does lead to inflammation throughout your whole body. And this can actually lead to things like insulin resistance. And then we see things like type 2 diabetes. We've got things like atherosclerosis or buildup of arteries that will then lead to heart disease. We've got all sorts of chronic diseases that all come from inflammation. And so what's important to sort of to think about is, so how do we prevent this? And actually, we know that most of the sort of risk factors for this are actually diet related. So we see things like high blood pressure, high blood cholesterol, alcohol, just being generally overweight or obese, or having an unhealthy diet. These things can all lead to the excess adipose tissue. And then what we see is this, what we call meta-inflammation, which is this central adiposity. So like where the fat stores are sort of around the abdomen. And this deposition of fat around internal body organs, such as the liver or the kidneys, this can really cause, high inflammatory state within the body. And this, is secreting those increased levels of inflammatory molecules. And it's just like a bad situation. So I think it's important for us to address the underlying cause of this. And in doing so, we probably want to be eating a way that is not just preventing that low-grade inflammation from occurring in the first place, but also sort of treating potential inflammation that's going on at the moment, and also preventing further inflammation from occurring. So if we think about the first step, preventing that sort of low-grade chronic inflammation, we can kind of do that by getting down to a healthy weight. Then we can actually treat the current inflammation that's going on in the body potentially with like polyunsaturated fatty acids, such as omega-3 from your oily fish and chia seed, flaxseed, etc. And then we actually want to prevent what we call oxidation in the body, which actually causes sort of excessive production of what we call sort of a reactive oxygen species. And this can actually cause damage of surrounding tissues, which then leads to inflammation. Sorry, I hope it's not a little too complicated, but basically what we want to do is we want to eat foods that prevent the oxidation from occurring and therefore prevent damage around the sort of surrounding tissues. So we can do that with antioxidants. So you most probably have heard of antioxidants like vitamin C, vitamin E, the sort of polyphenols and flavonoids. Like, it's a whole subject in itself. Maybe that's another podcast.
Yeah, definitely another a whole area to unpack. When it comes to inflammation, Rachel, just to stay on that for a second, because you've mentioned there some of the say anti-inflammatory foods. I use that term very, very loosely in terms of, like, you know, omega-3, but making good food choices that can potentially support inflammation. And one of the reason I say that is because sometimes people will ask, I'm sure you get this, you know, what do I need to eat to reduce inflammation? I'm like, okay, well, let's look at your lifestyle, let's look at your food, let's look at your sleep, let's look at your stress levels. All of these things obviously play a role, and I'm always hesitant to say, you know, eat oily fish and you'll be fine, because that's not the answer. But is there also certain foods that we eat that will rise inflammation or raise inflammation? Because it's obviously the approach of including foods that are going to work for anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, etc. But are there other foods that we should be avoiding that massively increase inflammation in the body?
Absolutely. And just on your point, I think it is important that we don't focus too much on the specific nutrients, because we don't eat nutrients, we eat food, and actually we don't eat single foods, we have a dietary pattern. So it's important that you think about that dietary pattern on an everyday basis, and you also think about, like you said, the stress, the exercise, the sleep. These are huge risk factors for things like inflammation. But just on pro-inflammatory foods, I think this can really be something that you can just try and stay away from, or try and limit, or just leave for mindful indulgences, for example. So those are foods that are highly processed, maybe deep fried foods with a lot of added sugar or a lot of added salt, the typical foods that we probably want to limit in the diet for X, Y, and Z reasons. These are the foods that are going to be more pro-inflammatory in the body. So that's, if we're thinking at a nutrient level, we're thinking about trans fats or saturated fats. When
it comes to reducing inflammation, then for people, obviously, as you mentioned, the avoidance of certain foods, the inclusion of other foods, you also touched on that nutrition is a science and not an opinion, which I love. I think that's such an amazing approach for anybody to take when it comes to something that can be scientifically researched, has multitude of data backing up particular claims, particularly with the stuff that you put out. But with that in mind, I have to ask this question, Rachel, as somebody that in my mind cuts through a lot of the bullshit online. I think your Instagram page does that. It's like, here are the myth busting, here's the science, anything else you're hearing, it's an opinion, but here's what the data says. But is there any particular pet peeve that you're seeing online at the minute that you're like, that's just not true? Either one that's being peddled out by, potential influencers or people with hidden agendas or whatever it is. Is there any one in particular at the minute that irks you more than any others?
This is a hard one because, I think that everyone in the wellness industry is trying to do their very best to make, the planet a healthier one, to make people happier and healthier in every way. But, you hit the nail on the head when you brought up the fact that, nutrition is a science, not an opinion. And so even though people are trying to do their very best, the reality is that they're actually causing more harm than good, because nutrients, if consumed in, incorrect levels, whether that be low amounts or, excessive amounts, that can cause damage in the body. That can cause disease over time, and can also prevent, peak performance and energy and all sorts, in the moment. But I think that the areas that I get really quite concerned about is just around, one size fits all. So any sort of influencer or brand that is talking about a certain diet or a certain pill or anything that can kind of give that quick fix to everyone, I think you should be very wary of that. And that really brings me to my area of focus, which is one size does not fit all. And not one of my clients actually follows exactly the same sort of dietary pattern or lifestyle. And that's because everyone is so different. So that's the area that I'm just so passionate about trying to move people away from, that you cannot look online and, do research into the perfect diet for you, because you will never find that. The perfect diet for you is not a diet, it's a lifestyle. It's a way of living according to your body's needs. And I genuinely believe that the science is telling us that that is dependent on our DNA.
Can you expand on that a little bit, just because it's the area that I wanted to explore on the podcast, because it's obviously the DNA way is your approach and your area of expertise. And again, outside my circle of competence, so I can only guide the potential questions because I am deep in that research. But talk about your framework, talk about the DNA way and eating for people around their unique requirements, because I think that approach, it's definitely the thing that separates you from others. But explain a little bit how that approach works.
So I think it's important to just go a little step back and to think about the beginning of my sort of career as a registered dietitian. And that was in the NHS, practicing in a hospital in Chelsea and Westminster. And at that time I was, treating people, and I was speaking to patients about how they can, get through their current disease state in a healthy way with nutrition, and also thinking about how can people effectively lose weight or help with the digestive issues based upon sort of nutrition that we are kind of taught based upon general dietary guidelines. And what was interesting was that I actually had a background in genetics anyway from my previous degree. And I'd actually published research in how the food that we eat can change our genetics or let's say change our genetic expression, which would lead to disease. So I was very interested in the genetic side of things, but wasn't able to practice, particularly within the NHS for obvious reasons. There's not the funding, and also it's not an area of science that registered dietitians are very aware of. And so I was extremely passionate about being able to give people personalized recommendations that were not based upon general dietary guidelines, because as much as they are a good thing for population nutrition, it's just not enough right now to be able to give people the most effective way to, reduce their risk of heart disease or diabetes or lose fat, or, it's not good enough anymore, because we have this emerging area of science over the last 15 years. And so just pulling it back to the framework, I've basically created a sort of a formula that effectively takes someone from A to B, A being really confused about what to eat, following a lot of fad diets, being constantly on a sort of dieting cycle. And then B, where we want to get them to, is a place of liberation, feeling completely empowered with the knowledge about their body and exactly what it needs from a food point of view, and also lifestyle point of view as well. So the framework is a proven method, and I've helped hundreds of clients using this method so far. And it really starts with actually priming the body and priming the mind, because, we know that there's no point giving personalized dietary recommendations or lifestyle recommendations if that person is not primed. So we need to, balance hunger hormones. We need to boost metabolism, make sure that they're in a really good place mentally to be able to take on this new way of living. And then the second sort of phase is all about unlocking their potential. So at this point, we would delve into their results, and we can talk a little bit about what that really means and the science around that in a little bit. But at this point, people are really starting to unlock their potential and empowering themselves about what their body needs. And we would then put together a diet and lifestyle plan based upon what their body needs. And in doing so, we then solidify. So that's the next phase. So we're solidifying these as habits, because again, this is long-term change. This isn't a quick fix. This isn't a diet. This really is a way of living, eating the DNA way for life. And then finally, we think about optimizing. And this is a time to optimize other areas that are very, very important to the individual. And again, that's going to be very personalized as well. And that could also be called biohacking as well, which is one of those buzzwords, I guess. But it really just puts the cherry on top and just makes sure that that person is really, really making sure that they've gone from 0 to 100 with their journey. And they are feeling confident to be able to continue this for life. And it's so great that people trust in the process, because they really do see the results much faster than anything they've ever done before. And that's because their body's responding to it, because it's right for them based on science, based on their DNA. And they're motivated to make a change because they know that the recommendations are based upon them as an individual.
What's the biggest thing since you've created the framework that you've changed your mind about? Because I know when you're doing extensive training and research, you're constantly coming up and seeing the new trends, the new data, the new research that's coming kind of to the forefront. And again, the nature of science is that it changes based on research and based on the direction that it goes. But if you can take yourself back to before you created the framework, because I know myself included, I'd say hundreds of misconceptions until you kind of dig in deeper into, well, this is actually what's scientifically backed. This is what you anecdotally tried, and it kind of made a nice fit. But what's the biggest thing you've changed your mind about in recent years? Or is there anything that jumps to mind when I say that since you created the framework?
I mean, I would definitely say that the biggest sort of misconception was really around how to effectively lose weight from a food point of view, but also maybe an exercise point of view as well. And so, when we're working in the NHS, we have guidelines to work around, and yeah, they're great, but they're not going to be effective for everybody. And so the framework, creating the DNA way has allowed me to understand that actually, no, we cannot tell everybody to do this because, or X, let's say, because every individual requires their own personalized recommendations for weight loss, for effective fat burning, to ensure that the body is tapping into those fat stores. How do we make them feel as satiated as possible? How do we effectively target the fat around their abdomen? It's really, really a key area that has just kind of blown me away in the way that I practice. And I mean, I think it's probably a great idea if maybe we actually go back into the science of the DNA way itself and nutrigenomics. I think that will probably be very helpful as well.
With that, and again, I've got kind of two segue questions that I want to kind of get into, but before I'm going to kind of jump with the first one that obviously makes the most sense. What are some of the common weight loss mistakes you see then? Because you mentioned it there that, there's so much individual variability that needs to be considered when it comes to fat reduction, weight loss, etc. But what are some of the general mistakes you see people making when it comes to trying to lose weight?
I would say that a big, big, big problem that I see quite often is that people are guessing their calorie deficits. And in doing so, you can be in quite an extreme calorie deficit and your body actually shut off and go into this sort of starvation syndrome. And this is, I guess, concerning because then people aren't losing the weight that they want to. And that's usually why, they may be coming to me to figure out what the heck's going on. And so what we really need to do is consider a genetic variant that they have in the gene, what we call the UCP1 gene. And this can really identify someone's ability to balance energy within the body. And without going into too much science, in layman's terms, it just gives us a really great idea to the optimal calorie deficit that someone requires for optimal weight loss.
Talk about starvation syndrome.
Yes, I wish more people would talk about starvation syndrome because this is basically the body's evolutionary adaptation to starvation. So if you think back, thousands of years when, food was quite scarce and the body would get really, really good at conserving its energy so that you literally didn't die. And the body still does it now. So if you don't give it enough energy, if you give it less than your body requires to function on a daily basis just at rest, so if you're, for example, feeding less than your basal metabolic rate or resting metabolic rate, you are putting yourself at risk of your body going into starvation syndrome, where it's basically naturally dropping its metabolism, and you are basically going to hold on to all of that fat. Your body's not going to allow it to be burned. And so it's a tricky one. It's a tricky situation, because then it's not even a case of, well, we just, decrease the amount that you're eating. Because sometimes that can be like, how do you decrease more than what you're eating at the moment? Because then you would, really be starving. So then it's taking the individual into consideration, taking their diet history, in the sense of, have they been on diets for years? Because this is also a risk factor as well for someone going into a sort of a state of metabolic impairment. That's what we call it. And yeah, it's just a really tricky situation. So again, I really can't stress enough that finding out that optimal calorie deficit is important, in addition to so many other things. But if we're thinking about making sure that the body is nourished and has enough energy to live and to flourish, like that's where we should be putting our focus.
Can you expand on or explain metabolic impairment and who's at risk of that?
Yeah, so basically this is a impairment within the body where when the body feels like it's starving, it will literally change its metabolic function in the way that it will get really, really good at conserving energy and not letting go of fat. So I would say that anyone who is going on an extremely low calorie diet may be putting themselves at a, higher risk of going into that sort of metabolic impairment, or anyone who's had a regular history and sort of years of yo-yo dieting. And this is usually really presenting in women who are middle-aged, who've maybe had children, and they just can't seem to shift the weight. And it's usually because they've been dieting for many, many years, on and off. Their weight's gone up and down, up and down. And when we lose weight, we naturally do, have a slower metabolism as the body shrinks in size. But then when they gain the weight again, they have actually been shown in studies to not get back to their previous metabolism or metabolic rate. So again, over time, it gets lower and lower and lower, and it's just a really unpleasant situation for some people. And I'm not saying that men aren't also at risk. It's just I would say that probably 75% of my clients are women. So I probably just see it more in those women.
How would you recommend then somebody go about either boosting their metabolism? So if you're somebody on the spectrum, because there's a lot of people listening to this podcast, some are in that realm of metabolic impairment. Hopefully, if you've been long-term listening to the podcast, you're not, because you know that extreme diets and dropping below your BMR, your basal metabolic rate, and eating 900 calories a day just isn't sustainable and does more damage and more harm than good for the most part. But what would you recommend for people looking to boost their metabolism? Everyone from that spectrum of potential metabolic impairment to, Jane, Sarah, John, Jack, who just want to lose a little bit of body fat, who want to boost up their metabolism. What are some of your kind of go-tos for that in terms of advice or recommendation that you'd offer?
Let's talk about how to boost metabolism first, because it is a sort of misconception that you can kind of eat foods like spicy foods or things like green tea to boost your metabolism. But actually, the long and short of it is that, okay, you see a slight increase in the moment, but it's not a long-term, increase in your metabolism. So I think that, if you enjoy those foods, 100%, you should continue eating them and drinking the green tea, but it's not going to boost your metabolism over time. I think that the main area of focus will be increasing lean muscle in the body. As you probably know, you're the expert in this sort of strength-based activity, and in addition to protein and energy surplus can actually increase lean muscle in the body, and that's metabolically active. In doing so, you naturally increase your metabolic rate. And this is so important for everybody who is aging, which is everyone, because every year that we age, we lose a ton of muscle. And so our metabolic rate, again, is naturally decreasing as we age. So that's definitely key. I would say that a great way to increase the sort of thermogenic area of your metabolism, or how do we increase thermogenesis in the body, which is the energy that your body requires to break down food, you could think about increasing your fiber intake on a daily basis, because fiber is indigestible to the body. So the body tries to break it down but cannot. And in doing so, it's expending a lot of energy and increasing your metabolism.
I love that. It's fantastic. I think when one of my pet peeves personally, this is just my thing when I see things online, that it's take this supplement, drink this tea, this skinny tea or this whatever tea that'll boost your metabolism. And like, something as complex as your metabolism isn't going to be fixed by having a cup of tea. So I think it's just taking that little bit of a proactive approach with it, as you said, that the training, the resistance training, increasing your metabolic rate, increasing your fiber because it's indigestible, all the other things we've talked about, the sleep and the recovery and all of those things are going to impact metabolism. So look at it holistically versus what tea do I need to drink or what food do I need to eat.
And then actually just talking about the individual who may be metabolically impaired, like we just spoke about, maybe going into what we call starvation syndrome. Again, it's hard for me to give individual advice over a podcast, but just as a sort of rule of thumb, if you are eating less than your basal metabolic rate, then your body is always going to be, at risk of starvation syndrome. So it's about increasing to your full requirements, which includes your activity factor as well. So your basal metabolic rate plus the amount of energy that you require to move, and then maybe stay there for a little bit, allow your body to trust itself again. And then the approach that you would take to be able to lose the fat thereafter would have to be very personalized to make sure that you're not at risk of going back into that state of metabolic impairment.
For anyone unfamiliar with BMR or basic metabolic rate, can you explain it in your own words what that is?
Yeah, so basal metabolic rate and resting metabolic rate are kind of the same thing. It is the quantifiable way of addressing how much energy or calories your body requires at rest for the sort of functions in your body that don't require your say-so. So, for example, the beating of your heart, the regulation of your body temperature, your lungs breathing in and out, all of the things that are going on in the background, your body needs energy to do these things. So your basal metabolic rate or resting metabolic rate, that's really a measure of that. I'm going to
jump out on a topic you covered recently on Instagram, which I was really interested in personally as somebody that likes to have a drink now and then. Alcohol sensitivity. This is an area that I clearly had a gap in my weakness, because I went down kind of checking out studies and I went on to PubMed, etc. after I saw your post, because I kind of put it front of mind, because I'm like, oh, I'm actually not familiar with the research on this, and just in general about alcohol sensitivity, because alcohol is one of those kind of blind spots that the basic calorie intake for it, the effect that it has on metabolism, the effect it'll have on displacement of potential nutrients that you're eating with meals, all the kind of basic stuff. But talk about alcohol sensitivity, because I really enjoyed this post that you put up recently.
Yeah, so obviously alcohol is a compound that we find in many of, the UK's favourite beverages, whether that be beer or wine. I don't need to explain what alcohol is. Everyone knows what it is. But what we know is that certain people have variations of genes or let's say just DNA that alter their ability to break down alcohol. So we have this gene called the ALDH2 gene. And this codes or tells the body how to break down alcohol. So it codes for an enzyme called aldehyde dehydrogenase. And certain people have a really inefficient ability to break down the alcohol because of their enzyme, or let's say lack of. And this makes those people very sensitive to drinking alcohol. So again, they're just going to have really unpleasant symptoms like, maybe nausea or, a rapid heartbeat. like when people go really red in the face, like these are all symptoms of someone who may have a alcohol sensitivity.
And then it's so funny because as soon as I read that post, I thought back to my college days and my roommate, because I was the one that could drink and I was totally fine until I think I hit 25, and then my hangovers got considerably worse every year. But in college at 18, 19, he would be dying after one night out or after a few drinks. His face would go all red and he'd be sick and feeling really hungover the next day. And I was like, maybe he didn't have the enzymes.
Maybe he had the AA or AG variation of that gene. Who knows?
And I spent years making fun of him, just telling him he couldn't handle his alcohol. So I feel really bad now. I'm like, there's actually probably a genetic component to why you couldn't handle it. So I'll best send him a follow-up sorry message after this podcast. Talk about alcohol tips for weight loss. Then you kind of doubled over these two posts just because I know they kind of work well off one another. But when it comes to people looking to lose body fat, looking to lose weight, reduce body fat in general, what are some of the alcohol tips that you would advise or offer to people?
I would say that there are definitely smarter alcohol choices. And again, disclaimer, have less than 14 units of alcohol each week, alcohol-free days, etc., etc. You know the drill. But when it comes to those smart choices for weight loss, you want to be thinking about the sort of choices that are going to be lowest in sugar. And so that could be anything from a spirit with something like sparkling water and maybe some fresh lime or fresh grapefruit, I love. And thinking about not just those slimline tonics, because they're also full of sugar. So can you find some literally low calorie tonic maybe? If you are drinking wine, if you're drinking a good wine, it's really hard for me to make these recommendations because you don't want to ruin a good wine. So if you are drinking a really nice wine, you probably just want to have a smaller glass and have a glass of water in between, further glasses. But if you're drinking a, wine that you've just gotten from a pub or, from a bar and it's not like super nice, then you can always ask for a couple of ice cubes in there just to make the drink go further, keep you hydrated. That's a really great tip. And then staying away from, your beers, which actually contain quite a lot of sugar and are quite calorific.
Yeah, I think it's really useful because it's kind of a case of making the dietary and the lifestyle choices that, you're not having too much alcohol, you're factoring it in and then just making wiser choices. I think like I'm a brandy drinker, like I'm a spirit drinker. I don't drink beer and I haven't drank cider in years, but I am a spirit drinker. So, and it's something that works quite well in terms of feel pretty good on it and kind of calorie wise and the whole lot. It tends to work quite well into a fitness lifestyle within moderation, of course. Another thing that I want to touch on, because we've touched on alcohol, and two of the main notes that I had for today's podcast was alcohol and dairy, just because I know you've covered both. Talk about dairy. And I know you do Myth Busting Mondays on your Instagram. This one came up. It was quite a while back when I saw it. But talk about dairy and just the myth busting element of and the misconceptions that people hold when it comes to dairy in general. Pro, con, take this whatever direction you like.
Yeah, so again, when thinking about something like dairy, I'm not going to be talking about the ethical reasons that we shouldn't be eating dairy. It's, something that we all need to be aware of and, thinking about more plant-based varieties of dairy, but we don't need to be scared of dairy. I think that's one thing that I really try and get across in my Instagram posts, that actually dairy can be part of a really healthy, balanced diet. It features in one of the healthiest diets in the world, such as the Mediterranean style diet, and can really be part of everyone's everyday life for its fantastic nutrient profile, that being, protein, which is extremely high in things like Greek yogurt, almost as much as a protein shake. You can get the same amount of protein from some Greek yogurt. We've got really key nutrients in there, such as iodine for thyroid health. If you're cutting out dairy, then you're probably going to be low in iodine. Your thyroid might be affected, will be affected, because iodine is one of the key ingredients for your thyroid hormones. Again, that alters your weight or ability to, lose weight. So it's definitely not just dairy, just all foods. Like, don't be scared of them. There's a place for everybody. And, there are going to be some people with certain intolerances to lactose, which is sort of the sugar that we find in dairy products. And, if that is the case, if you do have the CC or CT variant of that MCM6 gene, you're most probably going to have problems with breaking lactose down in the body because you don't have enough of the lactase, the enzyme to break it down. So, okay, maybe you want to reduce that. But do you want to maybe choose a lactose-free milk, which actually retains the nutrition profile of something as nutritious as milk? Or do you want to go more plant-based? And if you are going more plant-based, that's also fine. My fridge is full of plant-based milks and dairy-free products in addition to dairy. But I always go for the fortified versions that actually contain the calcium, the vitamin D, the B12, hopefully some of the iodine. It's really important that if we're ever cutting anything out, we're thinking about how can we replace that food with something as nutritious. So we're not when we're not close to any sort of nutrient deficiencies. And, I might be banging on about the importance of calcium, but bone health is so, so important. And if you do not eat enough calcium-rich foods at the moment, at this stage of your life, wherever you may be, you're going to be putting yourself at risk of a issue with your bone density in the future, putting yourself at risk of osteopenia or osteoporosis. And then you're going to have bone breakages and probably hospital admissions when you're, in your 70s or 80s. And again, you're not thinking about that now, but it's something to think about. I worked on those geriatric wards, and it's not a nice place to be. So yeah, it's definitely an area that I do want to talk about. And when I do test for certain genetic variants, I do test someone's risk of low bone mass. We've got this gene that can really help us understand that, and someone's risk. So yeah, that's dairy.
I'm going to follow up on that just because there's a lot of people who listen to this podcast who either don't consume dairy for ethical reasons, like you mentioned. Again, outside of anything that's ethical on any food choice, I'm like, that's a completely different conversation when you're talking about nutritionally versus ethically. If you're ethically removing a food, there's no real conversation to be had in it, in my opinion. It's kind of, that's what you want to do, you can do it. But for some reason, or for whatever reason, someone removes it, either ethical reasons, lactose intolerance reasons, or just a removal of dairy for the calorie reasons. For some reason that some people will do that. What are some of the plant-based sources of calcium that we can kind of hedge our bets with then if we decide that we're removing dairy from our nutritional plan?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because we do want to be getting calcium from non-dairy sources as well. We have to think about sustainability of the planet as well. So thinking about calcium sources that are not sort of dairy-based, you can think about consuming your fish, your salmon or your sardines with the bones. Again, that's not for me, so I don't choose to do that, but some people do. You've actually got a orange, which has around 80 milligrams of calcium in, which again is not massive. It's only, around a third of what something like a pot of Greek yogurt would have, but it still, counts. We've got all of those dark green leafy veggies. We've got almonds, calcium set tofu, which is usually the case. If you look on the back of your tofu, it will usually be set with calcium. So, these are all calcium rich sources. Again, you just have to eat a lot of it to actually meet your requirements. And what we know is that certain people at certain stages of their lives require more calcium. But even if you are in the early stages of your life, if you have certain variations of this gene called the GC gene, we know that you have enhanced requirements. You need more calcium in the body than someone who didn't have that risk variant. And so again, it's just knowing your body and what you need.
I just have one final question, Rachel, before I tell everybody where they can connect with you, where they can get the testing done, where they can work on the framework, everything. I'm curious because we've covered so many different things today, between dairy and alcohol to common weight loss mistakes to inflammation, genetics, eating the DNA way. But if you could go back 10 years ago, because I know this is when your journey really started and began, and this may not be a nutritional advice, it may not be dietary advice, but if you could go back to yourself 10 years ago, what advice would you offer yourself?
I would say it definitely is nutrition-based advice that I would be telling myself, which would be probably around the supplements that I was taking. So I would tell myself to stop taking all of those supplements and literally guessing what I needed, because I actually was taking supplements in quite high, nutrients and compounds in quite high toxic amounts looking back. And I'm sure that did not do my body any good. And when I think about where I am now, I have a personalized supplement regime that's based upon my genetic profile from my test. And yeah, it would just be stop taking those supplements, stop guessing, because, it's just doing you way more harm than good.
I have a follow-up. I have to ask the follow-up on it. Any supplement jump to mind in terms of, again, as somebody that has had that exact same issue myself, where I'm like, oh, I need to take, loads of omega-3, or I need to take creatine, or I need to take X, Y, or Z, not realizing that there's obviously genetic components that decide what you need to take. There's obviously nutritional components on what you need to take. What supplements come to mind? And this isn't I ask this as not a Pandora's box for people listening who go, oh, I'm going to stop taking whatever supplement Rachel's about to say. But what were the ones that kind of jumped up for you, or what were the ones that you were taking in quite high doses back then that you just really didn't need to be taking?
Yeah, great question. I mean, again, we could talk about this for a long, long time. There were quite a lot of supplements there. But if I just think about one that comes to mind, which may also resonate with your audience, it was like a skin, hair and nails one. And I know that many women and men take this for enhanced appearance. And this supplement, or, a number of these supplements do contain high levels of zinc. And long-term zinc supplementation actually causes copper imbalances within the body, and that can lead to hair loss and issues around, your appearance thereafter. And so that's probably one of the reasons why I didn't look, in optimal health, because I was taking these supplements thinking that, it was going to do me all, the best things for my hair, etc. And it's an unregulated area, and I just want people to stay away from these supplements that they just don't need. So, if you can take one supplement, take a vitamin D tablet, right? Protect yourself against vitamin D deficiency. But apart from that, unless you know your DNA profiling, there's literally no reason why you would need a supplement, unless you were obviously removing whole food groups and you were following a very restrictive diet that did require supplementation.
Love it. That's such an awesome way to finish. I think that gives us a nice little wrap up into everything we talked about. Rachel, for everybody that wants to connect with you, either to work with you directly, or that wants to get any DNA profiling, or that wants to just follow your content online, anywhere you want to send people now, feel free, and I will link all of those in today's show notes for the podcast.
Amazing. Well, I guess the best way to connect is always on Instagram. So it's at the DNA Dietitian, and that's with a T, not a C, because I'm in the UK, not in the US. And if you want to visit my website, thednadietitian.co.uk, then you can actually sign up to the waitlist for the online program, which is going to be an amazing time for you to learn more about your body. Remember to prime your mind and your body, unlock your potential, solidify the habits, and then optimize. So I'm really excited, and I hope to see all of you soon in my DMs, connecting with me or in some way or another. So yeah, really great. Thank you so much for having me on, Brian.
Pleasure is all mine. And for everybody listening, as I said, I will link those in the show notes. Go hit Rachel up on DM on Instagram. As I said, your content and myth-busting Monday in particular is my favorite, because it always makes me think, no more than the alcohol sensitivity that led me down that rabbit hole. But I'm really appreciated because it makes me see my blind spots. And I think everybody listening will get value from following your content as well. So Rachel, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for what you do. And I look forward to chatting again soon.
Amazing. Thanks.
There you have it. Rachel Clarkson on inflammation, boosting metabolism for weight loss and eating the DNA way. We covered so many different topics in today's episode. And as I mentioned several times, I've been really looking forward to this conversation since we set it up. Myself and Rachel were also talking about potentially doing a part 2 down the line around nutrigenomic factors when it comes to macronutrients, calories, fat loss, weight loss, etc. So if that's something you'd like, and to go a little bit deeper into the science, even into the genetic side, let me know. Hit me up on Instagram. Let me know. Brian_Keen_fitness. And as always, if you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to take a screenshot and you can tag both myself and Rachel on our Instagram pages, the DNA Dietitian for Rachel, and as I mentioned, Brian_Keen_fitness for my Instagram page. That's everything from this week's podcast. Catch you all next Monday.